The 5th of May, 1980. Masked men storm the Iranian embassy in the heart of London in the glare of the world's television cameras. Their mission? To rescue hostages seized by Iraqi terrorists. For the first time ever, the British Army's elite Special Air Service Regiment is seen in action. Inside the building, the SAS cleared each room, using carefully pre-planned drills. In the road outside, other SAS men watched for anyone attempting to escape from the building and checked for any explosive devices that the terrorists might have planted. Within 10 minutes, the surviving hostages had been rescued and all the terrorists accounted for. This may have seemed a far cry from the deserts of Egypt and Libya, where the SAS cut its teeth during World War II. But the techniques it developed during its raids on Axis airfields and supply dumps were put to good effect, not just during the Iranian embassy siege, but also in its operations during the 1982 Falklands War, especially the raids on the Argentinian airstrip on Pebble Island and in the 1991 Gulf War. In the summer of 1941, the British and Dominion forces in Egypt were stalemated. Earlier in the year, they had triumphantly driven the Italians out of Cyrenaica, the westernmost province of Libya. The Italian 10th Army had been destroyed, and tens of thousands of prisoners fell into British hands. But Hitler had then sent General Erwin Rommel and the Africa Corps to help his Italian ally. Rommel wasted little time. Within 6 weeks of arriving, he attacked, driving the British back into Egypt. Efforts to dislodge Rommel in the early summer of 1941 failed, and the British suffered heavy tank casualties. The only encouraging fact was that although under close siege, the garrison of the Libyan port of Tobruk continued to hold out against the Axis forces. During the stalemate, a 24-year-old commando officer, David Sterling, lay in hospital in Alexandria. He was recovering from injuries caused by a parachute jump that went wrong. Sterling had plenty of time to think about why the war in the Middle East seemed to be deadlocked, and how this could be broken. One of the most notable factors about the war in the Western Desert was the immense distances that needed to be covered. The distance from Tripoli, where the Africa Corps had landed, to Alexandria, the main British base, was over 1,000 miles. There were few proper roads, and to the south was an open flank of desert which could be navigated by experienced troops. Sterling realized that this made Rommel's supply lines particularly long and vulnerable. So too were the Africa Corps airfields and supply dumps. Attempts to disrupt them through commando raids from the sea had failed, because Axis forces were too alert. Also, the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet could not spare the ships for major amphibious operations. Its priority was to keep the still powerful Italian fleet at bay. The Navy was also struggling to keep Tobruk, as well as the strategically important island of Malta, supplied, in the face of constant Axis air attacks from both Italy and North Africa. Stirling concluded that a possible alternative was small groups of men which would be infiltrated through the Axis lines. Not only would the enemy find it more difficult to detect them, but they were capable of causing as much damage to supply dumps and airfields as larger bodies. For his raiding force to be effective, Stirling believed that it must be responsible for its own training and be directly answerable to the Commander-in-Chief, Middle East. He also proposed that his force should be sent in by parachute and operate in conjunction with any future British offensive. Once out of hospital, Stirling decided that if he submitted his proposal through normal channels, it would merely get lost in the bureaucracy that was Headquarters Middle East. He decided that a direct approach to the very top was the only way to get his ideas considered. Stirling therefore went in person to General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff of Headquarters Middle East, and handed him his pencil-written memorandum. Ritchie was impressed. He assured Stirling that he would show it in person to the Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck also liked Stirling's ideas and authorized him to recruit a force of 6 officers and 60 soldiers from the commandos in the Middle East. Thus, the SAS was born. David Stirling now had his Commander-in-Chief's approval for his special force. Next, he needed a name for it, and to choose his man. The name was the idea of Brigadier Dudley Clark, who was in charge of deception operations in the Middle East. It arose out of a plan to convince the Axis that the British had a large airborne force in the area. Stirling's 66 officers and men were rather grandly titled L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. Stirling's recruitment methods were informal. He was looking for men who could cope with the sort of deep penetration warfare he had in mind. Among his first recruits was his fellow guardsman, Captain Jock Lewis, a born organizer. Lewis had already gained considerable experience of carrying out raiding operations from Tobruk. Another was the pre-war Irish rugby football international, Blair "Paddy" Mayne, who was always thirsting for a fight. Mayne had operated with No. 11 Commando during the recent campaign against the Vichy French in Syria. Many of the other founder members of the SAS were guardsmen who had been in Stirling's commando. Stirling had not been given anywhere for his new force to base itself, so the SAS's first task was to steal a camp from a New Zealand unit which was at the front. After this act of piracy, Stirling imposed strict Brigade of Guards discipline. Parachute training for all SAS members was a priority, but Stirling had to improvise his own training equipment. He then had to persuade the RAF to lend him an elderly Bombay transport aircraft from which his recruits could complete their training. Aware that his men would be operating deep behind enemy lines, Stirling insisted that they become experts on German and Italian weapons. From the start, the SAS was obsessed with being the toughest of the tough. And, as David Stirling later explained, its methods and organization were very different from more conventional army units.
The whole purpose of the SAS was to be able to live for long periods behind the lines. Whereas the smallest unit in the commando was 12 men. In the case of the SAS, each troop should be divided down to 2 subunits of 4 men, and that each should be capable of operating by itself. We were totally a strategic type unit. One man would know a particular amount of navigation. Another would be fully trained in medical side. Another would have a specialist learning in explosives and every form of sabotage and so on. Each of them were equally capable of doing any task. The magic of having 4 men was that it wasn't commanded by any particular one of them.